Today we have a gospel reading that teaches us a little bit about the healing power of water. And water, if we look through Scripture, is a little bit of an ambiguous force in creation. We see in the book of Genesis, before God created anything, that the Spirit of God was moving upon the waters. And so water from the very beginning is this uncontrollable force in nature which can do great good, but can also, in some cases, do great harm. What do we see in Scripture? When God saw that mankind had become evil, that mankind had become filled with sin, he sends water in order to clear out his creation. And so in the flood, we see water as a force that is incredibly destructive. But that same water, the same waters of that flood, become also a means of salvation, because Noah builds the ark, and riding upon those waters, life on earth is saved. And so water in the story of the flood in Genesis is both a source of destruction and a source of salvation. In the book of Exodus, when the Israelites were being held captive in Egypt, as they were fleeing from Pharaoh's army, they stood at the banks of the Red Sea, and Moses struck the waters of the Red Sea with his staff, and the waters parted. And the people of Israel were able to pass through and secure their freedom, their salvation from their slavery in Egypt through those waters. But those same waters that parted way and were a source of salvation for the Israelites became a source of destruction for the Egyptians, who, as they were chasing after the Israelites, found the waters closing in on them on either side. Look at the book of Jonah. When Jonah, fleeing from the command that God had given to him, finds himself on the seas on a boat, and a great storm has picked up around the boat. The rain is falling. The waves are crashing on every side of the boat, so the people are afraid the boat will sink. And revealing to the other people on that boat who he was and what he was doing, the people decide he needs to be thrown overboard so that the waves will cease. And so in order to flee and escape from the destructive power of those waves, the water crashing on all sides of them, the people throw Jonah into the ocean. But that same ocean then produces the whale, that sea beast that comes forth and swallows up Jonah, and then brings him to exactly the place that God had called him to go. And so water here is a source of great destruction, a source of great terror, and also a source of God's will for our salvation. Water for us today, as all of us know, is one of the most basic necessities of life. We can't survive without water, and we learned that out here in the desert, maybe a little bit more than people in other parts of the country do. I learned recently that in some of the desert canyons that we have out here, especially over in Utah, over in the Moab area, in those canyons there are potholes. I'm sure that most of you have gone hiking in our canyons and seen the potholes that form when rain falls, water pools in areas on that soft sandstone, and it carves out just a little bit of a pool. And when it rains, those pools will become filled up. Most of the time they're dry, but when we get rain, those pools will fill up. Well, I learned that there's a breed of shrimp that live in those potholes. And most of the time they are desiccated. They're completely dried out, but they're still alive. They're there just dried out, waiting for the rains to come. And then when those potholes fill up, those shrimp come alive just long enough to eat a little bit and reproduce, and that's it. And then they go back to being dried out little guys. So water is this basic necessity of life, but water can also be one of the most destructive forces in nature. I remember back in 2011 when they had those terrible tsunamis in Japan. I'm sure you all remember seeing the videos of those absolutely horrendous tsunamis that were happening on the east coast of Japan. Well, while those were happening, Presbytera Allison was in Hawaii. And everybody in Hawaii was terrified, fearing that those same sorts of tsunami waves were going to hit Hawaii as well. They had to evacuate the coastlines. All of the hotels had to evacuate, and they had to go up into the mountains where they were on high ground. Now, thankfully, nothing ended up happening. A little bit of a high tide was only got in Hawaii. But I was sure at home in Michigan at the time, praying the Paralysis service for all of the people, especially for her, who were there in Hawaii. I remember seeing those videos and just thinking, from Japan, and thinking what an absolutely destructive force water can be. We see this as well in the New Testament. When Jesus Christ comes to his apostles who are on a boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus comes to them walking on the water. And they see in Jesus walking on the water this incredible testimony of who he is, of his divinity. And Jesus calls Peter out to him. And Peter steps on those same waters and finds at first that he can walk on them like Christ. But then as he begins to be overcome by the fears, the anxieties, as he sees the storm raging around him, he loses sight of Jesus Christ and he begins to sink beneath the waves. Peter almost drowns there, and if it weren't for Christ's presence with him, if it weren't for the fact that Jesus Christ were there, reaching out his hand to grab him and pull him up above those waves, then Peter would have sunk into the Sea of Galilee. Today we hear a story in our gospel about a pool that existed in Jerusalem. The name of this pool was Bethesda, which means in Hebrew, house of mercy. Many sick people would gather at this pool, which was known to be a source of healing. And whenever the waters of that pool would be stirred up, because the gospel today tells us that an angel of the Lord, an angel of God, would come down and stir up those waters. The church fathers say it was the archangel Michael who did that. Whenever that would happen and the waters of that pool would be stirred up, the first person to make it down into that pool, they'd race. The first person to make it down into that pool would be cured from whatever disease he or she may have had. Now, there was a man who was waiting at that pool who had been sick and was paralyzed for 38 years. 38 years he had been waiting by that pool, waiting to receive his healing. And Jesus, seeing him there and knowing how long he had been waiting, comes up to him and he asks him a very interesting question. He says to him, "Do you want to be made whole? Do you want to be healed? Do you want to be cured?" I could imagine many people would hear a question like that and maybe get a little bit frustrated and say, "I have been waiting here hoping to be cured for 38 years. What do you mean, do I want to be cured? Of course I want to be cured." But Jesus asks him this question, and the man responds and tells him that it's taken him this long, 38 years, to find his healing, not because he's lazy. I think some people wrongly look at this gospel reading and think that Jesus is saying to him, 38 years you've been waiting here. Do you really want to be cured? I mean, come on, 38 years. By now, surely you could have gotten into the pool. And some people will read into this story that Jesus is perhaps calling this man lazy. And this is an absolutely wrong interpretation. The man says to Jesus, it's not because of laziness that I've been here for such a long time. But instead, waiting here for 38 years, I have no one to help me. I'm totally alone. I have no one to lend me a hand. But when the waters of the pool get stirred up, someone else always gets in there first. There's no one to pick me up and carry me down into that pool so that I can find my healing in its waters. The man reveals to Jesus that it's taken him so long to get his healing, not because he's lazy, but because he has nobody to help him, because he's completely alone. Now, I think that he says this to Jesus, hoping that Jesus now will be the one to lift him up, to pick him up and carry him down into those waters, so that he can receive healing in the way that he had expected to, in the way that he had hoped to. And notice that this man, for 38 years, never gave up his hope. He waited there by that pool, believing that one day his chance would come. One day he would get the opportunity to make it down into those waters and receive his healing. And he believes maybe Jesus is the one who will help me, who will pick me up and carry me down into those waters. But instead, Jesus does something for him even more wonderful. He doesn't pick him up and carry him down into that pool. He simply looks at him and says, "Rise, stand up, pick up your bed, pick up your pallet, and walk." And the man hears the words of Jesus Christ and is obedient. He takes his feet, he stands. He takes up that bed on which he'd been laying for so many years, and he walks away. Now, the people who saw this happening knew that it was the Sabbath day. And so they were indignant that this man was carrying his bed. Well, that's work. You're not supposed to do something like that on the Sabbath day. They said, "What are you doing carrying your pallet, carrying your bed like that? You should not do that. It's the Sabbath day." And the man responds to them, "The person who said to me, the one who said to me, 'Rise, take up your pallet and walk,' he's the one who told me to do this. I'm being obedient to Jesus Christ." He didn't know that it was Jesus Christ. He says, "I'm being obedient to the one who gave me my healing. He told me, 'Rise, take up your bed and walk,' and I'm being obedient to him." Many of us find ourselves at different times during our life in a state of spiritual, if not physical, paralysis. We face difficult decisions, we face difficulties in life in regard to which often we don't know how to respond. The anxieties, the fears of life, we find them pressing on every side, and they tend to stop us in our tracks. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but I find if I only have a few things to do, only a few tasks to take care of at home, let's say, it's easy to do those. If I have a big list of tasks, I have a hard time even getting started, even though there's more to do. I get paralyzed by the sheer amount of work there is to do. And we can often allow the anxieties, the fears, the pressures of life to paralyze us, to stop us in our tracks. But in Jesus Christ, we have life, and we have hope, and we have healing. Jesus Christ, in his resurrection, is calling us today to arise along with him. He's calling us out of our spiritual paralysis. He's calling us to finally put our feet on the road to walk towards Him, to grow closer to Him and grow closer to our neighbor. All of us know that we're supposed to walk on that road, but we often have a hard time getting started because of our fears, because of our anxieties, because of the pressures that we feel. Jesus Christ is lifting out His hand to take hold of us and to pull us out of those waves. He's calling us to put aside that paralysis and to move towards Him in faith and in hope and in love. So today, as we continue to celebrate His glorious resurrection, let us listen and be obedient to the voice of God, who is telling us today, rise, take up your pallet, and walk. Christ is risen. Christos anesti. Christ is risen. Glory to His holy resurrection on the third day.